Imran wiped his hands on his apron, the scent of raw meat lingering in the chilly air of the storage room. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight as he checked the day's final order, a special delivery for a late-night New Year's celebration at an office he regularly supplied. He didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual for clients to need fresh meat for grand events. Faisal, his business partner, leaned against the truck, lighting a cigarette. His face, normally light-hearted, carried a strange tension tonight. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the cold night. "You're quiet today," Imran noted as he loaded the last crate into the truck. Faisal shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Just tired. Let's get this over with. It's late." Imran glanced at the address on the order form and frowned. Something about it felt off, a deep unease settling in his gut. The route wasn't new, but the late-night timing and Faisal's strange behavior only added to his growing discomfort. The truck rumbled along the deserted road, its headlights cutting through the thick fog that seemed to shroud the world in silence. The usual bustle of the city had faded, leaving only the occasional stray dog or flickering streetlight to break the monotony. Imran couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. The road stretched on, narrowing as it wound through an industrial area that felt more oppressive with each passing minute. Shadows loomed larger, trees and warehouses casting long, distorted shapes that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. "Do you ever feel like something's watching you out here?" Imran asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Faisal, sitting in the passenger seat, turned to him with a raised brow. "You sound paranoid. It's just a delivery." But Imran's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure standing in the distance behind the truck. When he blinked and looked again, it was gone. They finally pulled up to the office building, a large banquet hall at its side glowing faintly with dim, golden light. The place should have been lively, filled with chatter and music, but instead, it was deathly quiet. Imran parked the truck and stepped out, the silence pressing against his ears like a weight. Faisal grabbed the invoice and gestured toward the door. "Let's get this done." As they entered the building, the first thing that hit them was the smell. It wasn't the rich aroma of food or the faint tang of alcohol typical of parties. No, this was different. Pungent, metallic, like rusted iron. The hallway leading to the banquet hall stretched unnaturally long, the walls adorned with wilting decorations that seemed to sag under the weight of the oppressive atmosphere. Imran's breath hitched as he noticed faint smudges on the floor. At first, he thought they were spilled wine, but the deeper they went, the clearer it became. It was blood. When they stepped into the hall, Imran froze. Faisal dropped the invoice, the paper fluttering to the ground like a dead leaf. The room was a tableau of horror. Bodies were slumped over tables, faces contorted in expressions of pain and fear. Champagne glasses had toppled, their contents spilling onto the floor and mingling with the blood that pooled beneath the chairs. The cake sat untouched at the center of the room, a grotesque centerpiece to the macabre scene. Imran staggered backward, his stomach churning. What happened here?" Faisal didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the far end of the room, where the owner of the office, Saeed, lay sprawled across a table. His eyes were open, unseeing, and his hand clutched at his throat as though he had been trying to breathe in his final moments. Imran fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the police. We need help," he stammered, barely able to form words. "There's been a massacre." The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the building. Inspector Abbas was the first to step inside, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the scene. Imran and Faisal were ushered outside, where they waited in stunned silence. Imran's mind raced, replaying every moment of the delivery, trying to make sense of it. How could an ordinary order end in something like this? Faisal sat on the curb, his head in his hands. His cigarette burned out long ago, leaving only a faint trail of smoke curling into the cold air. They were poisoned, a forensic officer announced from the doorway, loud enough for everyone to hear. But not through the food, it's something else, something we haven't seen yet. Imran's unease grew. He glanced at Faisal, who seemed lost in thought. For the first time, he noticed something in Faisal's expression, something he couldn't quite place. Before Imran could say anything, Abbas approached them, his voice steady but grim. "We're pulling the CCTV footage. Until then, I need both of you to stay in town. This isn't just some accident. Someone wanted these people dead." Imran nodded, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much darker. The air around the office building felt heavy, suffocating, as though the tragedy that had unfolded inside had seeped into the night itself. The blue and red lights of the police cars bathed the scene in an eerie, pulsating glow, making the building look like it was alive, breathing in and out with the horror it held. Imran and Faisal stood near the truck, their breaths visible in the cold air. Faisal's usually carefree demeanor was now replaced by an unsettling silence. He stared at the ground, his jaw clenched, while Imran couldn't stop pacing, his eyes darting back to the office's entrance every time a uniformed officer walked in or out. The discovery of poison. Inside the banquet hall, forensic specialists meticulously examined the food spread. The cake stood out like a centerpiece of doom, its untouched layers mocking the scene of death around it. One of the specialists leaned closer, sniffing cautiously. "Found something," he called out. The lead investigator, Inspector Abbas, entered the room, his sharp eyes scanning the grotesque display. "What is it?" "There's a faint trace of an unknown substance in the frosting. We'll need to analyze it, but I'm guessing poison," the specialist replied. Abbas nodded grimly. And the rest of the food?" "Clean, no traces of contamination." Abbas frowned. "So it's just the cake." He turned to one of his subordinates. "Get a sample sent to the lab immediately." CCTV footage and clues. Hours later, in the dimly lit office room, Abbas and his team huddled around a glowing monitor, playing the CCTV footage retrieved from the banquet hall. Imran and Faisal had been called in to observe as witnesses. The footage began with the arrival of the staff and guests, all cheerful and laughing as they set up for the New Year's celebration. It looked like any ordinary party, until a man walked in carrying a gift box and a bouquet of flowers. The man, dressed in a dark suit and a hat pulled low over his face, strode confidently toward the office owner, Saeed, who greeted him with a forced smile. The two men exchanged words, but the tension between them was palpable. Their conversation grew more heated, with Saeed eventually waving his arms and shouting something that couldn't be heard over the muted footage. The man set the gift box and flowers on the table, gave Saeed one last look, and stormed out. The footage continued, showing Saeed pacing the room, visibly agitated, before joining the rest of the guests. The celebration resumed, with laughter and clinking glasses. At exactly 11:43 p.m., the cake was cut and slices were served to the guests. The footage showed everyone laughing and enjoying themselves. Then, without warning, guests began collapsing. One by one, they clutched their throats or staggered to their chairs, their faces contorted in pain. Within minutes, the hall was still. The footage cut to static. The room was silent as Abbas paused the video. He turned to Imran and Faisal. "Do either of you recognize the man who brought the gift and flowers?" Imran shook his head, his mind racing. Faisal, however, shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Abbas's gaze. The suspicious man, Junaid. The police quickly identified the mysterious man as Junaid, Said's former business partner. A search through criminal records revealed a troubling history. Junaid had been convicted of embezzlement 5 years ago after a bitter falling out with Said. He had been released from prison just a month ago. "This doesn't feel like a coincidence," Abbas muttered, pacing the room. Junaid had a motive. Said betrayed him, and this was his revenge. One officer chimed in. But how could he have poisoned the cake? He didn't bring it. Someone from the catering service delivered it. Abbas nodded. "We need to dig deeper, contact the caterers and track Junaid's movements over the past month. He's our prime suspect." Outside, Imran leaned against the truck, watching the commotion as officers swarmed the building. Faisal stood beside him, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "This doesn't feel real," Imran muttered. "How could something like this happen?" Faisal took a long drag before replying, his voice unusually flat. "Sometimes people let grudges consume them. Junaid probably never forgave Said for what he did." Imran glanced at Faisal, his unease deepening. "You sound like you understand him." Faisal laughed nervously. "I'm just saying, business can bring out the worst in people." Before Imran could press further, Abbas approached them. "We're letting you two go for now, but don't leave the city. We may have more questions." Later that night, while the police continued their investigation, Abbas received a call from one of his officers. "Sir, we checked Junaid's recent activity. He's been in contact with someone from the catering company." "Who?" Abbas asked, his heart racing. The officer hesitated before replying. "It's Faisal. He used to work for Junaid and Said before joining Imran's business." Abbas's mind raced as he connected the dots. Faisal had been unusually quiet during the investigation. He had a history with Junaid and Said, and he had been the one to arrange the delivery that night. "Bring Faisal in for questioning," Abbas ordered. Ending, Part 2 on suspense. As Faisal slept fitfully in his small apartment, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message appeared on the screen. "We're almost there. Stay quiet." Faisal stared at the message, his face pale. Outside his window, the fog thickened, and a shadow moved past his door. The tension built as Part 2 ended, leaving the audience questioning. Was Faisal truly involved? What was his connection to Junaid? And was there something darker at play? The cold night seemed endless as Faisal sat in his dimly lit apartment. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering bulb above him. His hands trembled as he stared at his phone, the cryptic message still glowing on the screen. "We're almost there. Stay quiet." A knock on the door shattered the oppressive silence. It was soft, almost polite, but in the stillness of the room, it sounded deafening. Faisal froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he rose from the couch, his steps hesitant as he approached the door. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice barely steady. No response. The knock came again, louder this time. Faisal's heart pounded in his chest. He reached for the door, his fingers brushing the cold metal handle when his phone buzzed again. Another message. "Don't open it." His blood ran cold. He stumbled back from the door, the weight of dread pressing down on him. The knocking stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then, faintly, he heard it. A low, guttural growl, like something inhuman standing just outside. Before Faisal could gather himself, the door burst open. Not from whatever was outside, but from the police. Inspector Abbas and 2 officers stormed in, guns drawn. Faisal collapsed to his knees, relief and fear battling within him. "Faisal Khan, you're under arrest," Abbas announced, his voice sharp and authoritative. Faisal didn't resist. He was dragged to his feet, his mind reeling as Abbas and his team searched the apartment. At the station, Faisal sat under the harsh glow of the interrogation room's fluorescent light. Abbas entered, tossing a file onto the table. "You've been lying to us, Faisal," he said coldly. "I don't know what you're talking about," Faisal mumbled, his hands trembling. "Oh, I think you do. You worked for Junaid and Saeed before this meat delivery business. You knew them both. And Junaid contacted you weeks before tonight's incident. Why didn't you tell us?" Abbas leaned closer, his eyes piercing. Faisal hesitated, his mind racing. "It's not what you think. Junaid asked me to meet, but I refused. I didn't want any trouble." "Then why is your number in the caterer's call logs?" Abbas slammed a photograph onto the table. It was a shot of Faisal entering a catering facility days before the delivery. Faisal's face paled. I was picking up some supplies. I didn't poison anyone." Abbas narrowed his eyes. "Maybe not directly, but you're hiding something, Faisal. And if you don't come clean, this will only get worse for you." As Faisal sat in silence, Abbas received a call from his team. "Sir, we found Junaid," the officer on the line said. Abbas's eyes widened. "Where?" "He's dead." The room fell silent. Abbas motioned for Faisal to stay seated and stepped out to take the call. The officer explained, "We found his body in an abandoned warehouse near the outskirts of the city. Looks like he's been dead for hours. Cause of death? Poison, the same substance as in the cake." Abbas's mind reeled. What about the gift and flowers he delivered to Saeed? They were laced with the poison. The toxic fumes would have spread slowly in the enclosed banquet hall, enough to kill everyone inside, the officer replied. "But how does Faisal fit into this?" Abbas asked, his voice tight with frustration. "That's the thing," the officer said, his tone uneasy. "Junaid wasn't working alone. We found a second set of footprints leading into the warehouse. Whoever was with him is still out there." Abbas returned to the interrogation room, his expression grim. Faisal looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "Junaid's dead," Abbas said bluntly, watching Faisal's reaction closely. Faisal's face fell. "What? No, that's not possible." "Oh, it's very possible. He was poisoned, just like the others. But here's what's strange. We found evidence that he wasn't working alone. Someone helped him plan this. Someone who had access to the catering company. Someone like you." Faisal's voice cracked as he stammered, I didn't do anything. Junaid was paranoid. He said Saeed ruined his life, but I told him to let it go." Abbas slammed his fists on the table. "Enough lies. Tell me the truth, Faisal, or you'll go down for all of this." Tears streamed down Faisal's face. "It wasn't me. It wasn't me. It was Saeed's brother, Kashif. He hated Junaid just as much. He wanted revenge for what Junaid did to their family business. I only found out about their plan when it was too late." Abbas's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to report it? You just let this happen?" Faisal buried his face in his hands, sobbing. "I was scared. Kashif said he'd come for me if I told anyone." Abbas didn't waste time. He ordered his team to track down Kashif, but as they stormed Kashif's house, they found nothing but a chilling scene. The house was empty, its interior eerily pristine. On the dining table sat a single cake, identical to the one from the banquet hall. Next to it was a handwritten note. "The past never dies. It only waits." Abbas's phone buzzed. It was another call from the forensic team. "Sir, we found something strange. The poison in the cake. It's an old formula, something that hasn't been used in decades. It's almost impossible to trace." Abbas frowned. "What are you saying?" "The way it was synthesized. It's like whoever made it isn't just trying to kill people. They're sending a message." Before Abbas could respond, the lights in Kashif's house flickered, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the halls. The officers drew their weapons, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. From the shadows, a figure emerged, not Kashif, but something far more terrifying. Its features were indistinct, shifting like smoke, and its voice was a chilling blend of whispers and screams. "The past never dies, and neither will I." The officers opened fire, but the bullets passed through the figure as though it weren't there. It vanished into the darkness, leaving only the sound of its haunting laughter. Back at the station, Abbas stared at the evidence laid out before him. The case had spiraled into something far beyond his understanding. Was this truly the work of men, or had Junaid's rage and Kashif's greed awakened something far more sinister? Faisal was released, but he was never the same. He left the city, haunted by nightmares of shadowy figures and the eerie laughter that seemed to follow him wherever he went. As for Abbas, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Somewhere, in the cold, dark night, the past was waiting to strike again. The detour through the mountains in lower Utah had been quiet for hours, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes the smallest sound seem deafening. The main highway had been destroyed in a flash flood and was under construction, forcing me to take this desolate route. It was well past midnight, and the narrow road wound through barren stretches of land. The stars were unnervingly bright, glittering against a pitch-black sky with no light pollution to obscure them. It felt like the heavens had opened up, revealing every star and constellation, but the scene felt unnatural, too vivid, as though the sky were watching me as much as I was watching it. I was dead tired and decided to pull off the road and sleep in my truck. The road stretched on endlessly. No cars in sight, no towns nearby. Just silence, save for the occasional desert wind that brushed against the cab. The mountains in the distance formed jagged silhouettes, and the landscape was nothing but desert scrub and shadows. I shut off the lights, plunging the truck into total darkness, and climbed into my bunk to sleep. The unseen and the unbelievable. Around 4 a.m., I jolted awake to an unsettling noise. It sounded like something, or someone, messing with the air and power cables between my cab and trailer, just inches from my head. My first thought was a wild animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. The truck gave a slight jolt, as if something heavy, hundreds of pounds, climbed onto the landing on the back of my truck. My pulse quickened. I slammed my hand against the cab wall, hard enough to echo loudly through the still night. For a moment, silence followed. Then, out of nowhere, a man's scream, blood-curdling and raw, pierced the air. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. As I reached for the keys to start the truck, the darkness outside began to shift. Out of the corner of my eye, on the horizon where the empty road stretched into nothingness, a faint glow appeared. At first, I thought it was a mirage, but it grew brighter. Slowly, a shimmering oval of light emerged. A portal, if I had to describe it. A figure stepped through, unnervingly tall and impossibly thin. His proportions were wrong. Arms too long, neck stretched unnaturally. His head tilted slightly, as though he were studying me from the distance. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of the eyes or exhaustion, but when I looked again, he was still there, motionless, illuminated by the portal's eerie glow. I scrambled to the front seat, turning on the headlights in a panic, but the light from my truck seemed to fade into the blackness, swallowed by the void. The stars above suddenly seemed brighter, almost pulsing, and the night sky shimmered in a way I couldn't explain. I thought back to something I had once read about Area 51. It wasn't far from where I was, well, in the grand scale of the desert at least. The rumors of strange sightings, government experiments, and aliens crossed my mind. As I stared out the windshield, I could have sworn the stars shifted in the sky, forming unnatural patterns. My heart pounded. Were these stars even stars? And then, in the distance, I saw something even stranger. A faint, greenish light streaked across the horizon like a shooting star, but it moved far too slowly, as though it were watching. For a moment, the desert lit up as if illuminated by the moon, casting long shadows across the barren ground. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, the kind of thing exhaustion plays on you. But that tall figure by the portal hadn't moved. It was still there, standing unnaturally still, and yet I felt like it was closer than before. Just as I reached for my radio to call for help, or at least to hear another human voice, the truck shook violently. Something had fallen off the back of the trailer, and a chorus of voices suddenly erupted around me, breaking the eerie silence. I flicked on the truck's exterior lights and was startled to see a group of men in fatigues surrounding my truck. It took me a moment to realize they were soldiers, their weapons drawn and faces tight with confusion. One of them was nursing a cut on his arm, clearly from falling off the back of my truck. The portal was gone. The tall figure had disappeared into the night. When I opened the cab door, one of the soldiers barked, "Don't move!" Another soldier, the apparent leader, stepped forward with a radio in hand. "Stand down," he told the others. "It's not part of the drill." "Drill?" I asked, my voice cracking. It turned out they were Army reserves conducting a midnight ruck march and capture exercise. They had mistaken my truck for the abandoned vehicle they were supposed to secure as part of their mission. But even after explaining myself and sharing a laugh with them about the bizarre misunderstanding, I couldn't shake what I had seen on that road. The soldiers were convinced I was just tired, and maybe they were right. But as they disappeared into the distance, I stared out into the dark desert, half expecting that glowing portal to reappear, or that impossibly tall figure to return. Something out there wasn't right, and I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me if I told them. The truck rumbled down the dark, desolate road, its engine the only sound breaking the overwhelming silence. I was still shaken by what I thought I had seen. A portal of light, the tall figure. But I convinced myself it must have been a trick of exhaustion. Still, an uneasy feeling clung to me, a gnawing sense that something wasn't right. As I continued driving, the desert seemed to stretch endlessly on both sides. The stars above were breathtakingly clear, brighter than I'd ever seen. And then, out of nowhere, a shooting star streaked across the sky. It was slow and deliberate, glowing with an unusual greenish hue that trailed behind it like smoke. At first, I felt awe. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic. But then came the stillness. Everything felt wrong. The hum of the engine, the sound of the tires on the cracked asphalt. Everything seemed muted, as though the world itself had held its breath. The air inside the cab felt heavier, and I noticed an unnatural stillness outside. There wasn't a single gust of wind, no rustle of the desert brush, no distant howl of a coyote. I couldn't shake the oppressive silence, the feeling that I was being watched. It was like the darkness itself was alive, pressing in on me. A chill ran down my spine, and instinctively I began to recite holy verses under my breath. The words gave me some comfort, though I could still feel an unsettling presence around me, as if unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. As I recited the verses, the sky above me began to shimmer. The stars, which had been so still and bright, seemed to pulse and shift, as though they were rearranging themselves. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I couldn't help but glance at my rearview mirror. The trailer behind me loomed in the dim reflection, its outline faint under the faint starlight. Suddenly, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something tall and thin darting across the road behind me. My heart skipped a beat. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "You're just tired. Focus." But the stillness persisted, and the desert around me felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it was silent, like the world was holding its breath. The road that never ends. It felt like I'd been driving forever, yet the road seemed endless, stretching into the void with no sign of civilization. I glanced at the dashboard clock, 4:17 a.m. Time seemed to crawl. I whispered more verses, feeling a faint sense of relief, but the heaviness remained. And then, on the horizon, I noticed something. A faint glow appeared again, like the one I had seen earlier when I stopped to sleep. It was dim at first, but as I drove closer it grew brighter, spreading across the horizon in hues of green and gold. My palms were slick with sweat as I clutched the wheel, debating whether to keep going or stop and turn back. As I approached the glow, I noticed the faint outline of something large and unfamiliar, a structure, or maybe a machine, partially concealed by the glowing mist. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, its edges sharp and angular, almost otherworldly. The glow began to flicker and pulse as I got closer, almost beckoning me forward. My breathing grew heavier as I slowed the truck to a crawl. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but a strange force compelled me to keep going. A loud bang came from the back of the truck, snapping me out of my daze. The trailer shook violently, as though something had slammed into it. I slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. My heart pounded as I fumbled to grab my flashlight. I opened the cab door slowly, stepping out into the still, silent night. The air felt colder than it should have, and the faint glow on the horizon flickered again, like it was alive. As I approached the trailer, I recited the verses again, louder this time, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. I shone the beam across the trailer, scanning the cables and connections. Everything looked intact, but the feeling of being watched intensified. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I spun around, shining the light into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Or so I thought. I looked up at the stars again, and for the first time, I noticed something truly terrifying. The stars weren't just shifting, they were moving, forming strange patterns that looked almost like symbols, or constellations I had never seen before. As I sped down the empty desert road, trying to shake off the dread from whatever I had encountered, I noticed something dart across the road ahead of me. My heart jumped, and I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights, was a black cat. But this wasn't just any cat. It had an otherworldly presence about it. Its fur was a deep, inky black that seemed to absorb the light around it, and its glowing yellow eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. I don't know how else to describe it, but it felt ancient, like it didn't belong to this time or place. The way it stood there, completely still, as if it were waiting for me, sent chills down my spine. For a moment, I considered honking or revving the engine to scare it away, but something stopped me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from its gaze. It felt like it was trying to tell me something, though I couldn't understand what. The desert was silent again, the stillness returning in full force. I whispered a holy verse under my breath, my voice trembling, but the cat didn't move. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step toward me, its eyes never breaking contact. And then it opened its mouth. Not to meow, but to let out a low, almost human-like sound. A strange mix between a growl and a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound itself felt like a warning. Suddenly, the cat turned and ran off into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But as it vanished, I noticed something on the side of the road. A faint glow, like the one I had seen earlier. My blood ran cold. I pulled the truck over, hesitating as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The glow was faint, pulsing like a dying ember. As I approached, I saw it was coming from an engraved stone, half buried in the dirt. The markings on it were strange, almost hieroglyphic, and I couldn't recognize the language. The same unease I had felt earlier returned, stronger than ever. I felt like I wasn't supposed to be here, like I was trespassing in a place I didn't belong. But before I could turn back, a loud thud came from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the truck, and that's when I saw it. The tall figure from before, standing beside my trailer. Its elongated limbs and unnatural posture were unmistakable, and it seemed to tilt its head again, as if studying me. The holy verses spilled from my lips instinctively, louder this time, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed to the sky. I looked up, and my heart nearly stopped. The stars were no longer just stars. They were moving, rearranging themselves into a pattern that formed a perfect circle. Inside the circle, the sky seemed to shimmer and ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. And then the circle lit up with a blinding light, and I heard the same guttural whisper from before. But this time, it was louder, more insistent, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The figure by the truck began to dissolve into the light, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. The cat's final warning. Just as I turned to make a break for the truck, the black cat reappeared, standing in front of the cab door. It hissed loudly, its glowing eyes fixed on me. For a moment I froze, unsure if it was trying to stop me or protect me. And then it turned its head toward the glowing sky and let out a loud, mournful yowl. The stars in the circle began to pulse faster, and the whispering turned into a deafening roar. The cat ran off into the darkness again, and I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I scrambled into the cab, started the engine, and floored it. The road seemed endless, but I didn't stop driving until the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The glow in the sky had faded, and the desert returned to its eerie silence. When I finally reached a small gas station miles down the road, I stepped out of the truck, my legs trembling. I tried to explain what had happened to the attendant, but they just gave me a puzzled look, muttering something about the desert playing tricks on people's minds. I don't know what I saw that night, the portal, the figure, the ancient black cat, but I know it wasn't just my imagination. Something out there was real, something ancient and otherworldly. And as I drove away from that lonely road, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't finished with me yet.